I'm Edward Thompson, 52, a retired Army sergeant who spent the last 5 years working nights at a warehouse loading dock. At last Sunday's family dinner, my brother-in-law Kevin smirked as he announced his latest promotion to regional sales manager. At least someone in the family is still climbing ladders instead of just existing, he said, glancing at me. My sister Sarah laughed. Oh Kevin, leave Eddie alone. He's just a washed-up old soldier who peaked at 25. The whole table erupted in laughter while I sat there, cutting my meatloaf in silence. What they didn't know was that 3 days earlier, I'd received a call from the White House. The president wanted to personally award me the Medal of Freedom for actions I'd taken during my deployment that I'd never spoken about to anyone. In 48 hours, I'd be standing in the Oval Office, receiving the nation's highest civilian honor. They had no idea their washed-up old soldier was about to make history. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated by your own family. 3 days before that humiliating family dinner, I was stacking pallets at the warehouse when my supervisor Mike called me over to the office. Eddie, you got a call on the main line. Says it's important. I wiped my hands on my work shirt, wondering who would call me at work. My family never bothered. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. Is this Sergeant Edward Thompson, service number 123456789? Former sergeant, I corrected. I've been out for 7 years. Mr. Thompson, this is Janet Morrison, from the White House Protocol Office. I'm calling regarding a matter of national importance that requires your immediate attention. My first thought was that someone was playing an elaborate prank. Mike had a twisted sense of humor sometimes. The White House. Come on, who is this really? Sir, I understand your skepticism. Could you please verify your deployment locations? Between 2015 and 2017, the specificity caught me off guard. Only military records would have that information. Afghanistan, Forward Operating Base Chapman, then briefly at Baghdad. Thank you for confirming, Mr. Thompson. President Harrison would like to personally present you with the Presidential Medal of Freedom this Thursday at 2 p.m. This is our nation's highest civilian honor, recognizing your extraordinary actions during Operation Mountain Shield. The floor felt like it shifted beneath my feet. Operation Mountain Shield. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 7 years. The classified mission that still haunted my dreams. The one I'd never been able to talk about with anyone, not even the VA counselors. I'm sorry. There must be some mistake, I managed. There's no mistake, sir. Your actions on March 15th, 2016, saved 47 civilians, including 12 children, from an imminent terrorist attack. The operation has been declassified as of last month, and the President specifically requested that you receive this recognition. My legs gave out, and I sank into Mike's desk chair. March 15th, 2016, the day that changed everything. The day I disobeyed direct orders and made a choice that could have gotten me court-martialed. Instead, it apparently made me a hero. Mr. Thompson, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. I never expected anyone to know about that day. The military has been tracking the long-term impacts of your actions for years. The intelligence you gathered and the risks you took prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life. This recognition is long overdue. I stared at the official White House letterhead that would arrive the next day, still processing the impossibility of it all. Who else knows about this? The ceremony will be covered by national media, but until Thursday, this information is strictly confidential. We'll need you to arrive at the White House by 1 p.m. for security screening and a brief meeting with the President before the ceremony. After I hung up, I sat alone in Mike's office for 20 minutes, staring at the concrete walls I'd grown so familiar with. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting the same harsh shadows they always did. But everything felt different now. Someone in the highest office in the land knew what I'd done. Someone understood the weight I'd been carrying alone for 7 years. When I finally walked back to the loading dock, Mike looked at me with concern. "Everything okay, Eddie? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just some old army business getting wrapped up," I said, picking up my clipboard. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since I'd hung up my uniform, I felt like the man I used to be was still worth something. That night after the family dinner, I sat in my small apartment staring at my old combat boots. They were worn leather, scuffed and faded, but I still polished them every Sunday morning out of habit. Some rituals die hard, even when the world tells you they don't matter anymore. I pulled out the cardboard box I kept in my bedroom closet, the one filled with memories my family had never bothered to ask about. My deployment photos, commendation letters, and a few personal items I'd managed to keep through 7 years of civilian struggle. At the bottom, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was my Ranger tab and the bronze star they'd given me for meritorious service. Sarah had been at the ceremony when they pinned that bronze star on my chest. She'd rolled her eyes when the colonel spoke about courage and dedication. "It's just a participation trophy," she'd whispered to our mother loud enough for me to hear. Even then, she couldn't let me have one moment of recognition. But the bronze star wasn't for the day that really mattered. That was still classified then. March 15th, 2016, Forward Operating Base, Chapman, Afghanistan. I was part of a routine patrol sweeping through a village outside coasts when our intelligence intercepted chatter about an imminent attack on a local school. The Taliban had identified it as a Western influence, educated girls alongside boys. My commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, made the call that probably saved his career and should have ended mine. "Stand down, Thompson. We don't have authorization to engage outside our patrol zone. Higher command needs to evaluate the intelligence." I could see the school from our position on the ridge. 47 people inside, including 12 little girls who couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. The intercepted communications were clear the attack would happen within the hour. During the afternoon session when attendance was highest, "Sir, with respect, by the time authorization comes through, those kids will be dead." "That's not our call to make, Sergeant. We follow orders." I've replayed that moment thousands of times. The choice between my duty to the chain of command and my duty to innocent lives. In the end, there was no choice at all. I took Private Morrison and Corporal Jackson with me. We moved down from the ridge against direct orders, using the terrain, to approach the school unseen. The Taliban fighters were already in position. 3 vehicles loaded with explosives positioned around the building's exits. What happened next was over in 12 minutes. But it felt like hours. We neutralized the immediate threat, evacuated the school, and called in air support to handle the secondary explosives. By the time Lieutenant Colonel Hayes arrived with backup, the danger was over and 47 people were alive who should have been dead. I expected a court-martial. Instead, I got a private commendation that wouldn't see daylight for 7 years, and a commander who never spoke to me the same way again. The official report called it quick thinking in a fluid situation. The truth was that I'd committed career suicide to save a bunch of kids whose names I never learned. The nightmares started about 6 months later. Not about the firefight bin, in plenty of those, but about the little girl in the pink headscarf, who'd smiled at me when we helped her out the school window. In my dreams, I was always too late, always following orders while she burned. The VA doctors called it moral injury, the psychological damage that comes from witnessing or perpetrating acts that violates your core values. But they had it backwards. My injury came from being told that saving those kids was somehow wrong, that following my conscience made me a bad soldier. When I got out in 2018, I thought I was leaving all of that behind. I thought I could just blend into civilian life and forget about the weight of command decisions and split-second choices. But you don't leave that part of yourself behind you. Just learn to carry it quieter. My family saw a man who couldn't hold down a real job, who worked nights at a warehouse instead of climbing corporate ladders. They saw failure where they should have seen someone still trying to serve, just in a different uniform. I put the combat boots back in their place by my bed and closed the box of memories. In 2 days, the President of the United States would pin a medal on my chest and tell the world what that little girl in the pink headscarf was worth. My family might finally understand that some things matter more than quarterly reports and sales targets. But even if they didn't, I was finally going to understand it myself. I pulled out my high school yearbook that night, something I hadn't looked at in years. There I was on page 47, Edward Thompson, valedictorian, National Merit Scholar, full ride to State University. The kid in that photo had the world ahead of him, or so everyone said. Sarah was 2 years younger, beautiful and popular, but she'd graduated middle of her pack. Somehow, over the years, our family's narrative had shifted. I became the disappointment, while she became the success story. It was like they'd collectively rewritten history to make their current judgment make sense. The pattern started early, when I chose ROTC over joining Sarah's boyfriend at his father's insurance agency. Mum shook her head. Eddie's always been stubborn, she'd tell people. Never did know what was good for him. When I got my commission as a second lieutenant, Dad's response was lukewarm at best. Well, I suppose the military will teach him discipline, maybe straighten him out, as if I was some wayward kid instead of a college graduate with a 3.8 GPA who'd chosen to serve his country. But the real shift happened when I deployed the first time. Sarah was getting married to Kevin, planning this elaborate wedding that consumed the family's attention for months. I was scheduled to ship out 2 weeks before the ceremony. "Can't you just ask for different orders?" Sarah had pleaded. "This is my special day, Eddie. I need my big brother there." I tried to explain that deployment schedules don't work that way, that thousands of people coordinate military operations, that my presence was needed elsewhere. But to the family, it became the story of Eddie choosing the army over family, Eddie being selfish, Eddie running away from his responsibilities as a brother. Kevin played into it perfectly. He was everything the family wanted in a son-in-law. Smooth-talking, focused on making money and impressing people. At the wedding, which I attended via video call from Afghanistan, he made a toast about how real men take care of their families at home while looking directly at the camera. When I came back from that first deployment, I was different. Anyone who's been in combat comes back different. But instead of understanding or compassion, I got lectures about adjusting my attitude and getting with the program. The program, apparently, was pretending that everything I'd seen and done overseas didn't matter once. I was back in civilian clothes. Sarah started introducing me at social gatherings as my brother who's in the army, with the same tone she might use to say, "My brother who collects stamps." It was something mildly embarrassing that had to be acknowledged but not dwelled upon. The real betrayal came during my second deployment. I was in Afghanistan, dealing with the aftermath of Operation Mountain Shield and the nightmares that followed. When Sarah called to tell me they were buying their first house, we could really use some help with the down payment. "Eddie, I know you don't have much, but whatever you could spare would mean a lot." I'd been sending half my combat pay home to help Mum and Dad with their medical bills. I had maybe $3,000 to my name, but family was family, so I sent them $2,000. The house they bought cost $400,000. My $2,000 was a rounding error in their budget, but it was my savings account. When I got home and saw the size of the place, saw Kevin's new BMW in the driveway, I realized I'd been played. They didn't need my money, they wanted to see if I'd give it. It's not about the money, Sarah explained when I confronted her. We wanted you to feel like you were part of the family, like you were contributing to something meaningful. Contributing to something meaningful. While I was dodging IEDs and making life or death decisions for strangers, she was worried I wasn't. Contributing to her mortgage payments. The final straw came when I got out of the army. I'd served 8 years, done 3 deployments, earned commendations and the respect of my fellow soldiers. But I came home to a job market that didn't value military experience and a family that saw my transition struggles as personal failures. Maybe you should have thought about your career prospects before you enlisted, Kevin said during one particularly brutal family dinner. The rest of us were building resumes while you were playing soldier, as if the men I'd served with, the friends I'd lost, the children I'd saved were all part of some elaborate game. When I took the warehouse job, the family's disappointment was palpable, not because they were worried about my well-being, but because my failure reflected poorly on them. Sarah started telling people I was figuring things out and finding my way. She'd pat my shoulder with the same condescension you'd show a child who was struggling with basic arithmetic. The worst part wasn't their dismissal. It was how they'd convinced themselves it was loving concern. They genuinely believed they were protecting me by keeping their expectations low, by not pushing me to overextend myself. They'd decided I was fragile, broken, incapable of handling real responsibility. They never asked about my nightmares, never wondered why I jumped at sudden noises, never considered that maybe their washed-up old soldier was carrying burdens they couldn't imagine. It was easier to write me off as a disappointment than to confront the reality of what military service actually costs. But in 36 hours, the President of the United States was going to tell a different story. My work badge was a simple plastic rectangle with my photo and Edward Thompson, night shift loader, printed in block letters. To my family, it represented everything I'd failed to become. To me, it represented something else entirely: honest work, reliable income, and the respect of people who judged me by my character rather than my resume. The warehouse operated 24/7, moving consumer goods from manufacturers to retail stores across 3 states. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. 4 days a week. The pay wasn't great, but it came with health insurance and a retirement plan. 2 things that mattered more than prestige when you were dealing with service-related medical issues. I'd been there 5 years, and in that time, I'd never called in sick, never missed a deadline, never had a single workplace incident. My supervisor, Mike, was a former Marine who'd done 2 tours in Iraq. He understood the value of military training, even if he never made a big deal about it. "Thompson, you're solid," he'd told me after my first year. "Don't know what you did before this, but you understand what it means to show up and do the job right." The other guys on the crew were good people. Tommy was working his way through community college, trying to become a paramedic. Roberto was supporting his elderly mother and 3 kids. James was a single father who'd lost his factory job when the plant moved overseas. We all had our stories, our reasons for being there, but nobody looked down on anyone else for doing what needed to be done. They knew I was a veteran. It was hard to hide the way I moved, the way I organized my workspace, the way I approached problems, but they didn't know the specifics, and they never pushed. Military guys have a way of recognizing each other without needing to compare war stories. The work itself was physical but straightforward. We loaded trucks, moved pallets, managed inventory. It required attention to detail, teamwork, and the ability to work efficiently under pressure. Skills that translated perfectly from military service, though my family never saw the connection. "You're wasting your potential," Sarah would say whenever she visited my apartment. "You could be doing so much more with your life." What she didn't understand was that I wasn't wasting anything. I was rebuilding, After years of carrying the weight of command decisions and the burden of classified actions, there was something healing about work that ended when the shift ended. Problems that could be solved with your hands and your back instead of your conscience. The night shift suited me. I'd always been a bit of an insomniac since coming back from Afghanistan, and working nights meant I could avoid the crowds and noise of daytime activity. The warehouse was quiet except for the hum of machinery and the occasional radio playing low in the background. Mike had started giving me additional responsibilities over the years. I coordinated with the day shift supervisors, trained new employees, and handled some of the more complex logistics planning. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important, and I was good at it. "You ever think about moving 2 days?" Mike asked me one morning as we finished up the shift. "Could probably get you a supervisor position if you wanted it." I appreciated the offer, but I'd found my rhythm in the nights. During the day, I could run errands, work out at the gym, and avoid the family gatherings that always left me feeling diminished. The warehouse was my space, my community, my place where Edward Thompson was valued for who he was, rather than judged for who he wasn't. My co-workers knew I lived alone, knew I was single, knew I didn't talk much about my personal life, but they also knew I was reliable, that I had their backs when things got tough, that I'd cover their shifts when they had family emergencies. That kind of respect meant more to me than any corporate title ever could. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family saw the warehouse job as evidence of my failure to launch, but the truth was more complicated. I'd chosen this work because it allowed me to serve in a different way. Every truck we loaded carried goods that people needed. Every shift we completed helped keep the supply chain moving. It wasn't saving lives in Afghanistan, but it was still contributing to something bigger than myself. Kevin particularly enjoyed making jokes about my career. At family gatherings, he'd ask loud questions about warehouse operations, always with a smirk that suggested he found the whole thing amusing. "So Eddie, what's the most challenging part of moving boxes? Do you have to think about which box goes where?" The guys at work would have torn him apart for that kind of condescension, but they also would have understood why I just smiled and changed the subject. Sometimes the best response to small people is to let them reveal their own character in 18 hours. I'd be standing in the Oval Office. I wondered what my warehouse family would think when they saw their night shift loader receiving the nation's highest civilian honor. They'd probably be proud, but not entirely surprised. Good people have a way of recognizing other good people, regardless of the uniform they wear. The medal citation draft arrived by secure courier the morning after the White House call. I signed for it with shaking hands, barely believing the official seal and letterhead were real. The document laid out, in precise military language, exactly what had happened on March 15th, 2016, details I'd never been allowed to discuss with anyone. Sergeant Edward Thompson demonstrated extraordinary heroism and selfless service during Operation Mountain Shield. Despite direct orders to maintain position, Sergeant Thompson made the decision to engage hostile forces threatening civilian lives, including those of 12 children at a local educational facility. His actions directly resulted in the preservation of 47 innocent lives and prevented what intelligence later confirmed would have been a catastrophic loss of life. Reading those words felt surreal. For 7 years, I'd carried the burden of that day alone. The what-ifs, the second-guessing, the nightmares about the little girl in the pink headscarf, all of it had been mine to bear in silence. Now, suddenly, someone with the highest security clearance in the nation was calling it heroism. The citation continued with details that brought it all flooding back. How we'd identified the 3-vehicle convoy positioning around the school. How Private Morrison had provided overwatch while Corporal Jackson and I moved to neutralize the immediate threat. How we'd evacuated 47 people through the school's rear windows in under 8 minutes while calling in air support to handle the secondary explosives. What the citation couldn't capture was the weight of making that choice. On that ridge, watching Lieutenant Colonel Hayes radio for authorization that wouldn't come in time, knowing that bureaucracy was about to get children killed. The moment when you realize that following orders means watching innocents die, and breaking orders means potentially destroying your career and facing court-martial. I'd made my choice based on something deeper than military protocols, the fundamental belief that some things are worth any personal cost. 47 lives were worth more than my rank, my career, my reputation, or my relationship with my commanding officer. The aftermath had been politically complicated. The Taliban fighters we'd engaged were later identified as part of a larger cell planning coordinated attacks across the region. The intelligence we'd gathered during the engagement led to operations that saved hundreds more lives over the following months. But officially, I'd still disobeyed direct orders. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had been furious, but he couldn't argue with results. The Bronze Star I'd received was for meritorious service rather than heroic action, a distinction that mattered. In military circles, it was recognition that I'd done well while avoiding acknowledgement that I'd been right to disobey. The psychological toll came later. Not guilt over my actions, but the isolation of carrying classified information that I couldn't process with anyone. The VA counselors knew I had nightmares, knew I jumped at sudden noises, knew I had trouble sleeping, but they didn't know why, and I couldn't tell them. My family interpreted my struggles as weakness, as evidence that I wasn't cut out for real-world challenges. They never understood that some experiences change you at a cellular level, that carrying the weight of life and death decisions leaves marks that don't show on the surface. The citation draft also explained why the recognition was coming now. Recent declassification of Operation Mountain Shield, combined with long-term intelligence assessments of Sergeant Thompson's actions, have confirmed the broader strategic impact of his decisions. The President has personally requested that this recognition be expedited to honor Sergeant Thompson's service and sacrifice. President Harrison had specifically requested this. The Commander-in-Chief, the person ultimately responsible for every military action taken in America's name, had read my file and decided I deserved the nation's highest civilian honor. I thought about calling someone to share the news, but who would I call? My family wouldn't understand the significance, and my co-workers didn't know enough about my military background to appreciate what this meant. The loneliness of carrying this secret was almost as overwhelming as the honor itself. That evening, I called the White House number provided in the packet. Janet Morrison answered on the second ring. "Mr. Thompson, how are you processing this news?" "I'm still not sure it's real," I admitted. "It's very real, and if I may say so, long overdue. The President read your file personally and was quite moved by your story. He specifically asked to meet with you privately before the ceremony." The idea of sitting across from the President, discussing actions I'd never been able to talk about with anyone, was both terrifying and cathartic. For the first time in 7 years, someone who understood command responsibility was going to hear my story. "Mrs. Morrison, who else will be at the ceremony? The ceremony will be covered by national media. Your story will likely be front-page news by Thursday evening. Are you prepared for that level of attention?" I hadn't considered the media attention. The thought of my family discovering my recognition through news coverage rather than from me directly added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. "I understand this is a lot to process," she continued. "The President wanted me to tell you that he considers this one of the most important recognitions he'll make during his presidency. Your actions represent the best of American values and military service." After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment, trying to imagine how the next 48 hours would unfold. The President of the United States was going to tell the world that their washed-up old soldier had saved 47 lives and changed the course of a military operation. The little girl in the pink headscarf was finally going to get the recognition she deserved. Sarah's corporate award sat prominently on the mantel. In her living room, a crystal trophy from Morrison and Associates Marketing recognizing her as Regional Director of the Year. It was the kind of achievement that made sense to our parents, the kind of success they could explain to their friends at church and the country club. She'd built her career methodically, starting as an account coordinator, right out of college, and working her way up through the ranks. Marketing suited her personality perfectly, as she was persuasive, socially adept, and had an intuitive understanding of what made people tick. By 34, she was managing a team of 12 and pulling in a six-figure salary. Kevin had been her college boyfriend, and their relationship had always been as much about strategic partnership as romance. He'd gone into commercial real estate while she focused on marketing, and together they'd built the kind of lifestyle that looked perfect. From the outside, the suburban house, the luxury cars, the annual vacations, to destinations that photographed well on social media. Our parents adored them. Kevin was the son they'd never had, ambitious, articulate, and focused on accumulating the markers of success that mattered in their social circle. Sarah was the daughter who'd fulfilled her potential, who'd made something of herself in a way that reflected well on their parenting. The family dynamic had gradually shifted over the years until Sarah became the unofficial spokesperson for family decisions. When our parents needed advice about investments or major purchases, they called Sarah. When extended family members wanted updates on how everyone was doing, they called Sarah. She'd become the center of the family universe, and she wore that responsibility with pride. "I just worry about Eddie," she'd tell people, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd accepted a burden with grace. "He's been struggling since he got out of the army. We try to include him in things, but it's hard when someone won't help themselves." She genuinely believed she was being protective, that her low expectations were a form of kindness. By framing my warehouse job as a temporary setback rather than a career choice, she could maintain the fiction that I was still figuring things out rather than acknowledge that I'd chosen a different path. The condescension was most apparent during family gatherings. Sarah would ask about my work with the tone of someone inquiring about a child's finger painting. "How are things at the warehouse, Eddie? Still enjoying the night shift?" The emphasis on enjoying suggested that she couldn't imagine anyone finding satisfaction in manual labor. Kevin played the role of supportive brother-in-law, but his comments cut deeper because they came wrapped in false concern. "Have you thought about going back to school, Eddie? I know some people who could help you explore your options." The implication was always that my current situation was temporary, something that needed to be fixed rather than respected. Their success wasn't accidental or undeserved. Sarah worked hard, put in long hours, and had genuine talent for her field. Kevin was equally dedicated to his career and had built a solid reputation in commercial real estate. They'd earned their achievements through intelligence, effort, and strategic thinking, but their success had also made them blind to other forms of value. They measured worth in salary figures and job titles, in the kind of achievements that could be quantified and compared. Military service, especially military service that couldn't be discussed or celebrated publicly, didn't fit into their framework for understanding success. Sarah had started planning a family celebration for next weekend, tied to her latest promotion to senior regional director. It would be the usual gathering: our parents, Kevin's parents, a few family friends, and me playing the role of the underachieving brother who everyone tolerated out of family obligation. The invitation had been extended with a casual assumption that I'd be grateful for the inclusion. "We're having a little celebration for my promotion next Saturday. Nothing fancy, just family and a few friends. You should come, Eddie. It might be good for you to be around successful people." The phrase, "successful people," had stung more than usual. Not because I was sensitive about my own achievements, but because it revealed how completely she'd written me off. In her mind, I wasn't successful, wasn't accomplished, wasn't worth taking seriously as a peer. She'd been making these judgments for years, always with the best intentions. When I'd struggled with nightmares after my second deployment, she'd suggested I just needed to get out more. When I'd taken the warehouse job, she'd offered to help me network with her professional contacts. When I'd declined invitations to double date with her friends, she'd worried that I was isolating myself. Never once had she asked what I actually wanted, what I found meaningful, what gave my life purpose. It was easier to assume I was broken than to consider that I might be choosing a different definition of success. The irony was that Sarah's achievements, impressive as they were, had never required the kind of moral courage that military service demanded. She'd never had to choose between following orders and saving lives. She'd never had to carry the weight of classified actions that couldn't be discussed or processed. She'd never had to rebuild her identity after coming home from war. But in 36 hours, that perspective was going to shift dramatically. The President of the United States was going to tell the world that her unsuccessful brother had saved 47 lives and earned the nation's highest civilian honor. The brother she'd been protecting with her low expectations was about to be recognized as a hero on the national stage. I wondered how she'd explain that to her successful friends. My dress blue uniform hung in my bedroom closet, like a ghost from another life. I'd kept it cleaned and pressed over the years, more out of habit than expectation that I'd ever wear it again. The dark blue wool, the gold buttons, the ribbon rack displaying my Bronze Star, Combat Infantryman badge, and deployment ribbons. It was the uniform of the man I used to be. The night before the ceremony, I laid it out on my bed with the same care I'd used preparing for inspections. Every crease had to be perfect, every ribbon precisely placed, every piece of brass polished to a mirror shine. The ritual was meditative, a bridge between my civilian present and my military past. The White House had called that afternoon with final details. Security screening at 1 p.m., private meeting with the President at 1:30, ceremony at 2 o'clock. National media would be present, including photographers from major newspapers and television networks. My story would be front-page news by evening. I'd started 3 different letters to my family and thrown them all away. How do you explain 7 years of silence? How do you tell people who've dismissed you as a failure that you've been carrying one of the most significant military honors in secrecy? Every attempt sounded either defensive or boastful, neither of which captured what I actually felt. The truth was more complicated than anger or vindication. I felt relief, the profound relief of finally being able to share a burden I'd carried alone for so long. I felt validation not just of my actions, but of the values that had driven those actions. And I felt a kind of nervous anticipation about stepping back into the spotlight after years of deliberately staying in the shadows. Sleep was impossible. I'd been dealing with insomnia since Afghanistan, but this was different. My mind kept cycling through the next day's events, imagining conversations with the President, wondering how the ceremony would feel, trying to process the reality that in less than 24 hours everyone would know. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and made coffee. I sat at my small kitchen table, looking out at the empty parking lot of my apartment complex, thinking about the distance between this moment and that day in Afghanistan. 7 years of carrying that secret, 7 years of being seen as something less than I was, 7 years of letting my family's narrative define me. The hardest part hadn't been their dismissal. It had been starting to believe it myself. When everyone around you treats you like a disappointment, when your own family sees you as broken or incomplete, you begin to internalize those judgments. I'd started measuring my worth by their standards instead of my own. The warehouse job had helped with that. Mike and the crew judged me by what I contributed, not by what I'd failed to achieve in their eyes. But even there, I'd been careful not to reveal too much about my military background. It was easier to be seen as competent but unremarkable than to risk disappointment if people expected more than I thought I could deliver. Tomorrow would change all of that. Tomorrow, the president would tell the world exactly what I'd done and why it mattered. The little girl in the pink headscarf would finally get the recognition she deserved. And maybe I'd finally stop carrying the weight of that day alone. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts, thinking about who I might want to call before the news broke. Mike deserved to hear it from me. Directly, he'd been a good supervisor and a decent man who'd never made me feel small for taking an entry-level job. But it was still too early to call anyone. The private meeting with the president was what I was most nervous about. According to Mrs. Morrison, he'd specifically requested time to discuss the operation and its impact. For the first time since that day in Afghanistan, I'd be talking to someone who understood command decisions, who knew the weight of sending people into harm's way, who could appreciate what it meant to choose conscience over orders. I tried to imagine what I'd say to him. How do you explain the moment when you realize that following the chain of command means watching children die? How do you describe the choice between career suicide and moral compromise? How do you convey the loneliness of carrying classified heroism for 7 years? Maybe I wouldn't need to explain any of it. Maybe he'd already read the classified after-action reports, already understood the strategic implications, already knew why my actions had mattered beyond the immediate lives saved. Maybe, for the first time in 7 years, I'd be talking to someone who already knew the whole story. The uniform fit perfectly, as if the 7 years of civilian life had been a temporary assignment rather than a permanent change. Looking in the mirror, I saw the soldier I used to be, confident, purposeful, proud of his service and his sacrifice. Tomorrow, the world would see him too. I folded the letter I'd been trying to write to my family and put it away. Some conversations needed to happen in person, after the ceremony, when the shock had worn off and we could all process what this meant for our relationships going forward. But one thing was certain: I was done letting other people define my worth. The President of the United States had read my file and decided I deserved the nation's highest honor. 47 people were alive because of choices I'd made under pressure. The little girl in the pink headscarf had grown up because I'd been willing to risk everything to save her. That was worth more than any corporate promotion or family approval. Tomorrow, everyone else would finally understand what I'd known all along. The White House security checkpoint felt like stepping into another world. Secret Service agents processed my credentials with professional courtesy, while media personnel set up equipment in the background. Other Medal of Freedom recipients were arriving: a civil rights lawyer, a breakthrough medical researcher, a teacher who'd revolutionized education in underserved communities. I was in extraordinary company. President Harrison was younger than I'd expected, with an energy that filled the room when he entered for our private meeting. He shook my hand firmly, looking me directly in the eyes. "Sergeant Thompson, it's an honor to meet you. I've read your file extensively, and I wanted to personally thank you for your service and sacrifice. Mr. President, the honor is mine. Please, sit down. I wanted to discuss Operation Mountain Shield before the ceremony. The classified after-action reports make clear that your decisions that day had implications far beyond the immediate lives saved." He pulled out a folder. I recognized the same operational briefings that had haunted my dreams for years. But when he spoke about them, there was no ambiguity, no second-guessing, no question about whether I'd made the right choice. "The intelligence you gathered during the engagement led to the identification and disruption of a terrorist cell planning coordinated attacks across 3 provinces. Conservative estimates suggest your actions ultimately saved over 300 lives beyond the immediate 47 at the school. 300 lives, I'd never known about the broader impact, never understood that my split-second decision had rippled outward in ways I couldn't have imagined. Your commanding officer filed a report recommending court-martial proceedings, the president continued, but higher command recognized the strategic value of your actions. The delay in your recognition was purely about operational security. We couldn't honor you publicly without compromising ongoing operations. The weight I'd been carrying for 7 years began to lift. The isolation, the uncertainty, the nightmares about whether I'd destroyed my career for nothing, all of it had been based on incomplete information. Mr. President, may I ask about the little girl? The one in the pink headscarf. His expression softened. Amina Hassan. She's 19 now, studying medicine at Kabul University. She sent a letter when she learned about this ceremony. Would you like to see it? He handed me a piece of paper covered in careful English script. Dear Sergeant Thompson, you probably don't remember me, but I was one of the children you saved at our school. I want you to know that because of your courage, I lived to become a doctor. I hope to save lives the way you saved mine. Thank you for choosing to help us when no one else could. Amina Hassan. I had to excuse myself for a moment. 7 years of nightmares about failing her, and she'd grown up to become exactly the kind of person the world needed more of. When we rejoined the other recipients in the East Room, the media presence was overwhelming. Cameras from every major network, photographers from national newspapers, reporters ready to document this moment for history. The ceremony itself was formal but intimate, with President Harrison speaking personally about each recipient's contributions. When my name was called, I stood at attention as he read my citation aloud for the first time in public. Edward Thompson demonstrated extraordinary heroism and selfless service during Operation Mountain Shield. Despite direct orders to maintain position, Sergeant Thompson made the decision to engage hostile forces threatening civilian lives, including those of 12 children at a local educational facility. The medal itself was heavier than I'd expected, its weight both literal and symbolic. As President Harrison placed it around my neck, he leaned in and said quietly, "The nation owes you a debt of gratitude, Sergeant. Thank you for having the courage to do what was right." The applause was thunderous, but what struck me most was the expression on the other recipients' faces. These were people who'd spent their lives fighting for justice, advancing human knowledge, serving their communities in extraordinary ways, and they were applauding me, the washed-up old soldier who'd been stacking boxes in a warehouse 12 hours earlier. During the photo session afterward, a reporter from the Washington Post approached me. "Sergeant Thompson, can you tell us how it feels to receive this recognition after years of working in relative obscurity?" "Ma'am, I've never worked in obscurity. I've worked in service. The location and visibility of that service doesn't determine its value." The question that followed would become the soundbite that defined the story. What would you say to people who might see your career path as unconventional for a Medal of Freedom recipient? I thought about my family, about Kevin's smirks and Sarah's condescension, about years of being treated like a disappointment who needed protection from his own limitations. I'd say that heroism isn't about the uniform you wear or the title on your business card. It's about the choices you make when no one is watching and the principles you're willing to sacrifice for. Some of the most heroic people I know are working night shifts, raising children as single parents, caring for elderly relatives, or serving their communities in ways that never make headlines. Recognition is nice, but it's not why you do the right thing. As we left the White House, Mrs. Morrison handed me a media packet. "Sergeant Thompson, your story will be front-page news in tomorrow's papers and the lead story on tonight's broadcasts. Are you prepared for the attention this will generate?" I looked back at the White House, then down at the medal in its presentation case. Amina Hassan was studying medicine because I'd been willing to disobey orders 7 years ago. 300 People were alive because I'd chosen conscience over career. The President of the United States had called me a hero in front of the national media. My phone was already buzzing with notifications, missed calls, text messages, voicemails. My family was about to discover that their washed-up old soldier had been keeping a very significant secret. Mrs. Morrison, I've been preparing for this attention my whole life. I just didn't know it. By 6 p.m., my face was on the front page of every major news website in America. Warehouse worker receives Medal of Freedom for secret heroism dominated the headlines, with my White House photo displayed prominently alongside details of Operation Mountain Shield that were finally declassified for public consumption. The story had everything media outlets. Loved a humble hero, a secret mission, a dramatic rescue, and the ultimate vindication of someone society had overlooked. Cable news channels were running segments about hidden heroes in plain sight, using my story as a launching point for discussions about how we value different types of service. My phone had become unusable. Hundreds of missed calls from reporters, producers, family members, and people I hadn't heard from in years. The voicemail box was full. The text messages were endless, and social media notifications were pinging constantly. I turned it off and drove to a diner across town, hoping for a quiet meal while the initial frenzy died down. It didn't work. The waitress recognized me from the news coverage before I'd even ordered coffee. "Are you the soldier from the White House today? The one who saved all those kids?" "Yes, ma'am. Your coffee's on the house, hun. Thank you for your service." Word spread quickly through the diner. Other customers approached respectfully, wanting to shake my hand, to thank me, to hear more about the story. These were working-class people who understood what it meant to be dismissed because of your job title, who appreciated that heroism could come from unexpected places. When I finally got home around 9 p.m., there was a news van parked outside my apartment complex. I drove past and spent the night at a budget motel, needing space to process the day's events without cameras and reporters documenting my every move. The coverage was overwhelming in its scope. CNN was running a special segment called The Real American Heroes, featuring my story alongside other veterans whose actions had remained classified for years. Fox News was discussing the importance of military service and the sacrifices made by ordinary Americans. MSNBC was analyzing the broader implications of my decision to disobey orders in service of moral principles. But it was the smaller stories that moved me most. Local news stations were interviewing my co-workers at the warehouse, and their responses revealed how completely my family had misunderstood my character. "Eddie Thompson is the most solid guy I know," Mike told Channel 7. "Reliable, hard-working, always looking out for his teammates." This recognition doesn't surprise me at all. It just explains what the rest of us already knew about his character. Tommy from the loading dock said, "Eddie's the guy you want next to you when things get tough. He never talks about himself, never brags, just shows up and does what needs to be done. We're proud to work with him." The contrast between their respect and my family's dismissal was striking. People who knew me through my actions, rather than my resume, had always seen my worth. It was the people who were supposed to know me best who'd failed to recognize who I really was. Social media was exploding with commentary. #HiddenHeroes was trending on Twitter, with thousands of people sharing stories about unrecognized service members, first responders, teachers, and community volunteers. My story had become a catalyst for broader conversations about how we define and recognize value in American society. Veterans organizations were reaching out, wanting me to speak at events, to help raise awareness about post-deployment challenges, to advocate for better support systems. Book publishers were calling my motel room, somehow having tracked down my location. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell the complete story of Operation Mountain Shield. The attention was both validating and overwhelming. For 7 years, I'd carried this secret alone, never able to process it with anyone who understood the context. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to know every detail, to understand every emotion, to analyze every decision. But the calls I was most curious about were the ones I wasn't taking, the dozens of messages from my family. Sarah had left increasingly frantic voicemails as the news coverage expanded. Kevin had sent a series of text messages that evolved from confusion to damage control. My parents had called repeatedly, their voices shifting from shock to embarrassment to something approaching pride. The most revealing message came from Kevin. "Eddie, we need to talk about how to handle this media attention. Sarah and I have some ideas about managing your public relations. This could be a great opportunity if we position it correctly." Even now, even after the President of the United States had honored me on national television, Kevin was trying to manage me, to control the narrative, to turn my recognition into something that benefited the family's image. I stayed in the motel for 2 days, letting the initial media frenzy settle while I processed what this recognition meant for my future. The warehouse had given me time, off-mic said. They were proud to have a Medal of Freedom recipient on their team and wanted me to take whatever time I needed. The story continued to generate coverage. Follow-up pieces explored my career, my family, relationships, and the broader questions about how America treats its veterans. Some reporters had tracked down Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who'd retired as a full colonel and was now working as a defense contractor. His statement was carefully diplomatic. Sergeant Thompson was an exceptional soldier who faced an impossible situation with courage and integrity. While I maintained that proper channels should have been followed, I cannot argue with the results of his actions or the recognition he's received. Even my former commanding officer, the man who'd recommended court-martial proceedings, was acknowledging that I'd made the right choice. By the 3rd day, I was ready to face my family. The time for carrying secrets was over, and it was time to have the conversations that should have happened years ago. They deserved an explanation, even if they might not deserve forgiveness. But first, I had to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with people who'd spent 7 years treating me like a disappointment, while I carried one of the nation's highest honors in silence. Sarah's text messages told the story of my family's shock better than any news coverage could. I scrolled through them on my motel room phone, watching 7 years of condescension transform into panic in real time. 2:47 p.m. Eddie, I just saw you on the news. Is this real? 3:15 p.m. Why didn't you tell us? How could you keep this secret? 3:52 p.m. Kevin and I are getting calls from reporters. We don't know what to say. For 23 p.m. Mom is crying. Dad doesn't understand. Please call us back. 5:08 p.m. The neighbors saw you on TV. Everyone's asking questions we can't answer. 6:31 p.m. Eddie, we're family. We should have known. We should have been there. The evolution was predictable: shock, hurt, embarrassment, and finally the assumption that I owed them an explanation. Not once did any of the messages acknowledge years of dismissive treatment or express pride in what I'd accomplished. It was all about how my secret had affected them, how my recognition had caught them unprepared. Kevin's messages were more strategic, already thinking about damage control. We need to coordinate our response to media inquiries. This affects the whole family's reputation. Even now, even after watching me receive the nation's highest civilian honor, he was worried about managing the optics. My parents had left voicemails that progressed from confusion to hurt to something resembling pride, but even their pride was filtered through embarrassment. Eddie, we're so proud of you, but we wish you'd trusted us with this. People are asking us questions about our son, the hero, and we don't know what to say. The family group chat, which I'd muted years ago, was exploding with activity. Extended, relatives, family, friends, and Kevin's business associates were all reaching out with congratulations and questions. The family that had written me off as a failure was now scrambling to understand how they'd missed such a significant part of my story. Sarah's final message, sent at 11:47 p.m., revealed the depth of their confusion. I keep thinking about all the times we tried to help you, all the advice we gave you about getting your life together. How were we supposed to know you were already a hero? Why didn't you tell us what you'd done? The answer was simple, though they probably wouldn't understand it. I hadn't told them because their version of success left no room for the kind of service I'd performed. They measured worth in salary figures and job titles, not in lives saved or principles upheld. They would have found a way to diminish even this recognition, to explain why it didn't really count as success in their terms. More troubling was Kevin's assumption that we needed to coordinate our response, as if my Medal of Freedom was a public relations crisis that required careful management rather than a recognition that should speak for itself. I thought about calling them back, about trying to explain 7 years of silence and the weight of carrying classified heroism, but every draft conversation I imagined ended the same way, with them making my recognition about their feelings, their embarrassment, their need to understand why I hadn't trusted them. The truth was that trust had to be earned, and they'd spent 7 years proving I couldn't trust them with my vulnerabilities, my struggles, or my worth as a human being. Why would I trust them with the most important thing I'd ever done? When I finally returned to work a week later, the entire warehouse crew was waiting for me. They'd decorated the break room with congratulatory signs and somehow managed to get a cake that read "Our Hero" in red, white, and blue frosting. Mike presented me with a work shirt that everyone had signed. "From the Brotherhood," he said simply. "We always knew you were special, Eddie. Now the whole world knows too." The signatures covered every inch of the shirt. Tommy had written, "Thanks for showing us what real leadership looks like." Roberto added, "Proud to work beside a hero." James signed it, "You make us all better." These weren't empty platitudes, were acknowledgements from people who'd worked alongside me for 5 years and seen my character in action. "The thing is," Mike said to the gathered crew, "this doesn't surprise any of us. Eddie's been showing us who he is every day. He's the guy who covers your shift when your kid is sick. He's the one who stays late to help finish a difficult load. He's the one who makes sure the new guys know they're part of the team." The contrast with my family's reaction was stark. These men had seen my worth through my actions, not my achievements. They'd respected me before they knew about Afghanistan, before they understood the full scope of my military service, before the president pinned a medal on my chest. We got interviewed by about a dozen reporters. Tommy laughed. All of them seemed shocked that we weren't shocked. They kept asking how we missed the signs that you were a war hero. "What signs?" Roberto added. "Eddie, you've always been solid. The medal just explains what we already knew about your character." The warehouse management had been fielding calls all week from reporters wanting to understand how a Medal of Freedom recipient ended up working the night shift loading dock. Mike had fielded most of them with the same message. "Eddie Thompson is exactly the kind of person you want on your team. His recognition doesn't change who he's always been." They offered me a promotion to day shift supervisor with a significant pay increase and management responsibilities. "You've earned it 10 times over," Mike said. And honestly, having a Medal of Freedom recipient in leadership would be good for everyone. I appreciated the offer, but I'd already been thinking about what came next. The ceremony had opened doors I'd never expected: speaking opportunities, consulting work, positions with veterans organizations that could use my experience and platform. "Mike, you've been better to me than family, but I think it's time for me to use this platform to help other veterans who are struggling with the same things I've struggled with." He nodded, understanding immediately. You've got our support, whatever you decide. But you'll always have a place here if you want it. The crew insisted on a group photo with the Medal of Freedom. As we posed together, I realized these men had given me something my family never had: unconditional respect based on character rather than achievements. They'd seen my worth when I was just another night shift worker, and they celebrated my recognition without any of the complicated emotions my family was processing. "Eddie," Tommy said as we were wrapping up, "my kid's been asking about you since he saw you on TV. Would you consider talking to his school about service and sacrifice?" The request felt like a calling. For 7 years, I'd carried the lessons of Operation Mountain Shield in silence. Now I had the opportunity to share not just the story, but the principles that had guided my actions, the importance of moral courage, the value of selfless service, the reality that heroism often comes from ordinary people making extraordinary choices. "I'd be honored," I said, and meant it. As I drove home that night, I thought about the different ways people had responded to my recognition. My family was processing their own embarrassment and confusion. The media was celebrating a compelling story, but my warehouse brothers had simply acknowledged what they'd always known, that worth isn't determined by titles or recognition, but by how you treat the people around you when no one is watching. Sarah called at 7 a.m. on a Saturday, 2 weeks after the ceremony. I almost didn't answer, but something in her persistence made me pick up. "Eddie, please don't hang up. We need to talk." Her voice was different, smaller, less confident than the sister who'd laughed at me over meatloaf 2 weeks earlier. "I'm listening. I've been thinking about everything, about how we treated you, about what we didn't know. I can't sleep, Eddie. I keep replaying every family dinner, every comment Kevin and I made, every time she stopped." Her voice breaking. For the first time in years, Sarah sounded vulnerable instead of condescending. "We were wrong. We were so wrong about everything. You were carrying this incredible burden, this amazing story, and we treated you like..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Like a disappointment," I said quietly, "like someone who needed to be managed and protected from his own limitations." "Yes, God, Eddie, yes. And the whole time you saved all those people. You're a hero, and we treated you like someone whose worth was determined by his job title and bank account." The silence stretched between us before she spoke again. "Kevin wants to apologize too. He feels terrible about the things he said. We both do." "What does Kevin feel terrible about, Sarah? The specific comments, or the fact that his comments are now public record thanks to the media coverage? That's not fair, isn't it? Kevin spent 7 years making jokes about my career, my choices, my worth as a person. Now that it's embarrassing for him, he wants to apologize. That's not the same as being sorry. We didn't know you didn't know because you never asked. You never asked what I'd done in the army, what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. You decided I was broken and treated me accordingly." Her crying was audible now. "How do we fix this, Eddie? How do we make this right?" It was the question I'd been asking myself for 2 weeks. Could family relationships recover from 7 years of dismissal and condescension? Could respect be rebuilt after it had been so thoroughly demolished? "Sarah, for 7 years, every family gathering was an exercise in explaining why I wasn't good enough. Every conversation was filtered through your assumption that I needed guidance, management, or pity. Do you understand how isolating that was? We thought we were helping. We thought we were being supportive by keeping your expectations low, by treating me like someone who couldn't handle real responsibility, by making jokes about my work in front of the whole family. We were wrong. We were completely wrong. But Eddie, we're family. That has to count for something." The assumption that family relationships should automatically be preserved, regardless of how destructive they'd become, was exactly the kind of thinking that had enabled years of dismissive treatment. Being family means you should have been the First people to see my worth, not the last. It means you should have known me well enough to recognize that I wouldn't take a job beneath my dignity, that I wouldn't accept being treated as less than I was without good reasons. What can we do? How can we show you that we understand now? You can start by accepting that this isn't about what you can do to fix your guilt. This is about 7 years of damage that doesn't disappear because you're embarrassed by the media coverage. That's not why we're calling, isn't it? When did you realize you were wrong about me, Sarah? When you saw me on television receiving the Medal of Freedom? Or when you started getting congratulatory calls from your friends? The silence that followed gave me my answer. I need time to think about what kind of relationship, if any, we can have going forward. But it won't be the old relationship where you manage my reputation and I accept your low expectations. That version of our family dynamic is over. Eddie, please. I'll call you when I'm ready to have this conversation properly. But Sarah, if we're going to rebuild this relationship, it starts with you understanding that the problem wasn't my failure to meet your standards. The problem was your standards for measuring human worth. My first speaking engagement was at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall downtown. 300 people packed into a room designed for half that number. Veterans and their families wanting to hear about Operation Mountain Shield and the journey from classified heroism to public recognition. I'd written my speech on index cards, but standing at the podium, I put them aside and spoke from the heart. 7 years ago, I made a choice that could have ended my military career. I disobeyed direct orders to save 47 civilians, including 12 children, from a terrorist attack. For 7 years, I carried that secret alone, never able to talk about it, never able to process it with anyone who understood. The room was silent, every face focused on my words. When I got out of the army, I took a job at a warehouse loading dock. My family saw this as failure evidence, that I couldn't handle the civilian world, that I was broken or limited. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't broken. I was carrying the weight of experiences I couldn't share, making meaning from service in the only way available to me. I looked out at the audience, gray-haired veterans, young families, middle-aged men and women who understood the complexity of transitioning from military to civilian life. The Medal of Freedom ceremony was incredible, but it wasn't the most important recognition I've received. The most important recognition came from my co-workers, people who knew me by my actions rather than my achievements. They saw my worth before they knew about Afghanistan, before they understood my military service, before the president pinned a medal on my chest. The applause was sustained, but I held up my hand to continue. We live in a society that measures worth by job titles, salary figures, and social status. But real worth comes from character, how you treat people when no one is watching, how you respond to adversity, whether you're willing to sacrifice for principles that matter more than personal advancement. A young veteran in the front row nodded, and I saw recognition in his eyes. Some of you are struggling with the transition from military to civilian life. Some of you feel like society doesn't understand your value, doesn't appreciate your service, doesn't see your worth beyond your current circumstances. I want you to know that your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition. It's determined by your character, your service, and your willingness to keep serving in whatever capacity you can. After the speech, the line of people wanting to talk stretched around the building. Veterans sharing their own stories of transition struggles. Family members trying to understand their loved ones' experiences. Young people asking about military service and moral courage. A woman in her 70s approached near the end of the line. My grandson is in Afghanistan right now. He's been there for 6 months, and I worry about him every day. But after hearing your story, I understand something I didn't before. He's not just serving his country, he's becoming the kind of person who can carry that responsibility. A young man, maybe 25, waited until everyone else had left. Sergeant Thompson, I got out of the Marines last year. I've been working at a grocery store, and my family keeps asking when I'm going to get a real job. They don't understand that I'm not broken. I'm just figuring out how to serve in a different way. What's your name, son? Marcus Rodriguez, sir. I did 2 tours in Iraq. Marcus, your service matters. Your character matters. Don't let anyone convince you that your worth is determined by their definition of success. You find your own way to serve, and you do it with pride. The speaking opportunities multiplied quickly. Veterans organizations, high schools, corporate leadership seminars, community groups, everyone wanted to hear about moral courage, about the choice between following orders and following conscience, about finding worth in service regardless of recognition. Each speech refined my message. Heroism isn't about uniform or title, it's about character. Service doesn't end when you leave the military, it just takes different forms. And your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. The letters started arriving within a week. Veterans who'd felt invisible, family members who'd gained new understanding, young people inspired to consider service. My story had become a catalyst for broader conversations about how we define and recognize value in American society. But the most meaningful response came from a simple email. Dear Mr. Thompson, my name is Amina Hassan. I am the girl in the pink headscarf from your story. I am now studying medicine and hope to save lives the way you saved mine. Thank you for showing me that heroes come in many forms. This was why the recognition mattered, not for my ego, but for the opportunity to inspire others to find their own ways to serve, to choose conscience over convenience, to understand that worth comes from character rather than title. The restaurant reservation confirmation arrived by email 2 months after the ceremony. Sarah had booked a private dining room at the city's most expensive steakhouse for a proper family celebration of my recognition. The invitation was carefully worded, emphasizing how proud they were and how much they wanted to honor me appropriately. I stared at the message for an hour before responding. The gesture felt hollow, a performance designed to manage their own guilt rather than genuine recognition of my worth. But I was curious about what this carefully orchestrated event would reveal about their actual understanding of the past 7 years. Kevin called that afternoon to coordinate details. His tone was different, respectful, in a way that felt calculated rather than authentic. Eddie, we want this to be perfect. We've invited Mom and Dad, my parents, a few close family friends, people who should have been celebrating you all along. The phrase "should have been celebrating you all along" was telling. It acknowledged their past failure while avoiding responsibility for actively creating the dynamic that Bade had made celebration impossible. Sarah's handling the arrangements. She wants this to be a night that shows how much we appreciate everything you've done. I agreed to attend, partly out of curiosity and partly because some conversations needed to happen in person. But I set conditions: no media, no social media posts, no attempts to manage the message or control the narrative. The private dining room was decorated with small American flags and copies of the Medal of Freedom citation blown up and framed. Sarah had clearly put thought into the details, trying to create an atmosphere that honored military service in the way she imagined it should be honored. Everyone was there when I arrived. My parents looking uncomfortable but proud, Kevin's parents making awkward small talk about my amazing achievement, family friends who'd largely ignored me for years, now eager to shake the hand of a Medal of Freedom recipient. The conversation was stilted, filled with the kind of careful politeness that emerges when everyone knows the subtext, but no one wants to address it directly. People asked about the White House ceremony, about meeting the president, about the media attention, but no one asked about the 7 years of silence, the isolation, or the weight of carrying classified heroism alone. Kevin stood to make a toast. and I braced myself for whatever carefully crafted message he'd prepared. To Eddie, who taught us that heroism comes in many forms and that true character reveals itself in ways we don't always recognize immediately. The toast was diplomatic, acknowledging their failure to recognize my worth while avoiding direct responsibility for actively diminishing it. It was the kind of corporate speak Kevin excelled at, technically accurate but emotionally hollow. Sarah's contribution was more personal but equally problematic. I want to apologize for not understanding, for not seeing what you were carrying, for not recognizing the hero you've always been. The apology focused on their ignorance rather than their actions, as if the problem had been a lack of information rather than a fundamental failure to respect my choices and dignity. My parents were quieter, clearly struggling with the disconnect between their long-held narrative about their son and the reality of his recognition. Dad managed, "We're proud of you, Eddie. We always were, even when we didn't understand. But pride that comes only after external validation isn't really pride, it's embarrassment." Management. As the evening progressed, I realized that this carefully orchestrated celebration was less about honoring me and more about allowing them to feel better about their past behavior by positioning themselves as proud family members who'd simply misunderstood rather than people who'd actively contributed to my isolation. They were rewriting history to preserve their own self-image. The breaking point came when Kevin mentioned his plans to write about my story for his company's newsletter, an inspiring example of hidden heroism in our own family. "Kevin," I said quietly, "this isn't a marketing opportunity. This is my life. Of course, I just thought you could turn my recognition into content that reflects well on you. Just like you're turning this dinner into a performance that makes you feel better about 7 years of dismissive treatment." The room went silent. Sarah looked stricken, Kevin defensive, my parents confused. "Eddie, we're trying to make amends," Sarah said. "No, you're trying to manage your guilt. There's a difference." I stood to leave, but turned back to address the room. "If you want to make amends, start by acknowledging what actually happened. For 7 years, you treated me like a disappointment who needed management and pity. You made jokes about my work, dismissed my choices, and convinced yourselves that your condescension was loving concern." "We were wrong," Sarah whispered. "Being wrong suggests a mistake. This was a pattern of behavior that lasted 7 years, and this performance tonight doesn't change any of it." I left the restaurant knowing that some relationships can't be repaired with good intentions and expensive dinners. The damage was too deep, the patterns too entrenched, the understanding too superficial. The veteran support group photos sat on my new desk to 12 men and women who understood the weight of service, the challenge of transition, and the complexity of carrying experiences that civilians couldn't fully comprehend. We met every Tuesday evening, not for therapy but for brotherhood. Marcus Rodriguez, the young Marine I'd met after my first speech, had become a regular. So had Linda Chen, an Air Force medic dealing with her own invisible wounds, and David Martinez, a Navy corpsman who'd saved lives in 3 different deployments. These weren't broken people, they were warriors learning to channel their strength in civilian contexts. "The thing about Edward's story," Marcus said during one session, "is that it proves what we've always known. Our worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it." Linda nodded. "I spent 2 years letting my family convince me I was struggling, that I needed to adjust my expectations. But I wasn't struggling. I was transitioning. There's a difference." Our group had become a chosen family of sorts, bound by shared understanding rather than blood relations. We celebrated each other's victories, supported each other through challenges, and never had to explain why certain sounds made us jump, or why we preferred to sit with our backs to walls. The speaking opportunities had evolved into something more substantial. Veterans Affairs had offered me a position as a liaison officer, working with transitioning service members who were struggling with civilian adjustment. The pay was less than some corporate offers I'd received, but the work was meaningful in ways that salary couldn't measure. My new office was in a converted warehouse fitting somehow. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd gone from loading trucks to counseling veterans in similar industrial spaces. But the work felt like a natural extension of the service I'd always wanted to provide. Edward, Dr. Patricia Wells, the program director, had said during my hiring interview, "Your story resonates because it's not about overcoming trauma. It's about finding meaning in service regardless of recognition." That's exactly what our transitioning veterans need to hear. The most unexpected development was meeting Rachel Morrison, a documentary filmmaker who'd reached out about telling the broader story of Operation Mountain Shield. She wasn't interested in the typical war hero narrative. She wanted to explore the psychological and social impact of carrying classified heroism. "What interests me," she'd said over coffee, "is how society's inability to recognize your worth affected your sense of self, and how that recognition ultimately came from within rather than from external validation." Rachel understood that my story wasn't about military heroism. It was about human dignity, about finding worth in service, regardless of how others perceive that service. She was smart, compassionate, and saw the deeper themes that most people missed. Our professional relationship had gradually become personal. She'd attended several of my speaking events, not for her documentary, but because she believed in the message. We'd started having dinner after group sessions, talking about the intersection of service and meaning, about how people find purpose in circumstances that others might see as limitations. "You know what I admire most about you," she'd said one evening. "You never let their dismissal define you. You kept serving, kept finding ways to contribute, kept maintaining your dignity even when they couldn't see it." The romance was unexpected but natural. Rachel saw me clearly not as the war hero the media had celebrated, not as the disappointment my family had created, but as the man who'd chosen service over convenience, principle over approval, character over recognition. Our veterans group had become a model for other cities. The combination of peer support, professional guidance, and purposeful work was helping transitioning service members find their footing in civilian life. We weren't trying to fix anyone, we were helping people understand that their worth wasn't determined by civilian society's ability to recognize it. "The beautiful thing about this group," David observed during one session, "is that we don't have to prove anything to each other. We know what service looks like, what sacrifice means, what it costs to carry responsibility for other people's lives." The group photo represented something my family had never provided: unconditional acceptance based on character rather than achievement. These people had known me for months, not decades, but they saw my worth more clearly than family members who'd known me since birth. As I looked at the photo, I realized I'd built something better than the family relationships I'd lost. I'd found people who shared my values, understood my experiences, and celebrated my contributions without needing external validation to confirm my worth. The little girl in the pink headscarf was studying medicine, inspired by the choice I'd made 7 years ago. Marcus was using his GI benefits to become a counselor, helping other veterans find purpose in civilian life. Linda was training to become a first responder, continuing her service in a new uniform. This was what legacy looked like, not recognition or family approval, but the ripple effects of choosing principle over convenience, service over status, character over comfort. Sarah's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after the failed restaurant celebration. The envelope was thick, suggesting she'd taken time to craft whatever message she hoped would repair our fractured relationship. "Dear Eddie," it began, "I've been in therapy since our last conversation, trying to understand how our family dynamic became so toxic, how we could have been so blind to who you really were. The letter was different from her previous attempts at reconciliation. Instead of focusing on her confusion or hurt, she was attempting genuine accountability. I realize now that our treatment of you wasn't about misunderstanding or lack of information. It was about our own insecurities and our need to feel superior to someone. Kevin and I built our sense of worth by comparing ourselves to you, by positioning ourselves as the successful ones while you struggled. She was getting closer to the truth, but I wondered if she truly understood the depth of damage that 7 years of condescension had caused. I keep thinking about that Sunday dinner, about laughing when Kevin called you a washed-up old soldier. I remember the look on your face, how you just kept cutting your meatloaf in silence. I knew we were hurting you, Eddie. We all knew, but it felt good to be the ones with everything figured out, to be the ones offering advice and managing expectations. The admission was more honest than anything she'd said before. This wasn't about ignorance. It was about cruelty disguised as concern. The therapy has helped me understand that we weren't protecting you by keeping our expectations low. We were protecting ourselves from having to acknowledge that maybe success looks different than we thought, that maybe worth isn't measured in salary and job titles. I set the letter down, surprised by her insight. Sarah had always been intelligent, but she'd never applied that intelligence to examining her own behavior. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking you to rebuild our relationship on the old terms, but I want you to know that I understand now. You weren't the one who needed to change, we were. The letter continued for 3 more pages, detailing specific incidents she remembered, acknowledging the pattern of dismissal and condescension, and taking responsibility for choices that had isolated me from my own family. Kevin and I are getting divorced, she wrote near the end. The Medal of Freedom ceremony forced us to examine who we'd become, and we didn't like what we saw. He's struggling with the fact that his public comments about you are now part of the permanent record. He's more concerned about his reputation than about the damage we caused. That wasn't entirely surprising. Kevin's apologies had always felt more about damage control than genuine remorse. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but if you're ever willing to try building something new, not the old family dynamic, but something based on mutual respect, I'm here. I called her that evening, the first time we'd spoken directly since the restaurant incident. Sarah, Eddie, thank you for calling. I wasn't sure you'd read the letter. I read it. It's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. I meant every word. Eddie, I'm so sorry. Not sorry that we got caught looking foolish. Not sorry that the media attention was awkward. I'm sorry that we treated you like you were less than you are. The conversation that followed was different from any we'd had in years. Sarah was listening instead of managing, asking questions instead of offering solutions, acknowledging my experiences instead of explaining them away. Can you help me understand what it was like, carrying that secret for 7 years while we treated you like a disappointment who needed protection from his own limitations? Yes, God, Eddie, yes. What was that like? For the first time, I told her about the nightmares, about the isolation of carrying classified heroism, about the weight of being dismissed by the people who should have known my worth. I told her about finding dignity in warehouse work, about the respect of co-workers who saw my character, about building a chosen family of people who understood service and sacrifice. I'm proud of you, she said finally. Not because of the Medal of Freedom, not because of the recognition. I'm proud of who you chose to be when no one was watching, when no one was celebrating, when your own family was treating you like you didn't matter. It was the kind of recognition I'd needed 7 years earlier, but it felt meaningful now because it came with understanding rather than ignorance. Sarah, I can't go back to the old relationship. I won't be managed or pitied or treated like someone who needs your guidance to navigate life. I don't want the old relationship either. I want to know my brother, the real one, not the version we created to make ourselves feel better. We talked for 2 hours, laying groundwork for something that might eventually become a healthy relationship. It wouldn't happen quickly, and it wouldn't erase 7 years of damage, but for the first time, it felt possible. The letter I wrote back was brief. Sarah, rebuilding trust takes time, but I'm willing to try. Not for the family we were, but for the family we might become if we're both willing to do the work. Some relationships can't be saved. Others can be rebuilt from the ground up, stronger than they were before. If both people are willing to examine their failures and commit to doing better, time would tell which category ours fell into. My new business card was simple. Edward Thompson, veterans advocate and speaker. No mention of the Medal of Freedom, no listing of military honors, just the work I'd chosen to do and the people I'd chosen to serve. The Veterans Affairs liaison position had evolved into something larger. I was traveling across the country, speaking to transitioning service members, consulting with organizations about veteran integration, and helping develop programs that recognize the value of military experience in civilian contexts. The work wasn't just professionally fulfilling, it was personally healing. Every veteran I helped find their footing in civilian life, every employer I convinced to value military experience, every family I helped understand their loved ones' struggles, it all felt like extending the service that had defined my adult life. Rachel's documentary, The Weight of Honor, had premiered at Sundance and was now being distributed to schools and veterans organizations. She'd captured something most war stories missed: the internal journey of carrying classified heroism, the psychology of being dismissed by society, and the process of finding worth, independent of external recognition. Edward's story resonates because it's not really about war, she'd said in interviews. It's about human dignity, about finding meaning in service, regardless of how others perceive that service. It's about the choice between letting other people define your worth or defining it yourself. We'd been married for 6 months now, a small ceremony attended by our veterans group, my warehouse brothers, and surprisingly Sarah. My sister had been working hard to rebuild our relationship, attending therapy, examining her own biases about success and worth. The process was slow, but it was genuine. Kevin hadn't been invited. Some bridges can't be rebuilt, and some people aren't willing to do the work required for genuine reconciliation. His public statements about my luck in receiving recognition revealed that he still didn't understand the difference between earned honor and accidental success. My parents were gradually adjusting to having a son whose worth they'd fundamentally misunderstood for years. The process was awkward. They wanted to be proud, but struggled with the implications of their past dismissal. We were building a careful relationship based on present reality rather than historical patterns. The speaking engagements had grown into something I'd never expected: a platform for changing how America thinks about service, worth, and recognition. My message was simple. Heroism isn't about uniform or title. It's about character. Service doesn't end when you leave the military. It just takes different forms. And your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. The beautiful thing about Edward's work, Marcus had said during a recent group session, is that he's helping people understand that they don't need permission to have worth. They don't need recognition to matter, and they don't need other people's approval to serve. The ripple effects continued to expand. Amina Hassan had graduated medical school and was working in a refugee clinic, directly serving the kind of vulnerable populations I'd protected in Afghanistan. Marcus had become a counselor, specializing in veteran transitions. Linda was now a paramedic, continuing her service as a first responder. The warehouse crew still sent Christmas cards, still invited me to barbecues, still treated me like family in ways my actual family never had. Mike had been promoted to regional manager and was implementing veteran hiring programs across multiple facilities. Eddie proved something we always suspected. he'd told a reporter. Character matters more than credentials. Someone who'll show up at 2 a.m. to cover your shift when your kid is sick. That's the person you want on your team, regardless of what their resume says. The nightmares about the little girl in the pink headscarf had stopped, not because I'd received recognition, but because I'd finally understood that my choice to save her had been worth any personal cost. The Medal of Freedom was meaningful, but it wasn't what gave my actions value. My actions had value because they reflected principles that mattered more than personal advancement. As I sat in my new office, looking at the Veterans Support Group, photos in Rachel's wedding ring catching the afternoon light, I thought about the journey from that humiliating family dinner to this moment of purposeful service. My family had called me a washed-up old soldier, and in their narrow definition of success, maybe I was. I didn't have the corporate title, the suburban mansion, the luxury car, or the social status they valued. But I had something more important, the knowledge that I'd chosen principle over convenience, service over status, character over comfort. The president had called me a hero, but heroes are made in moments of choice, not moments of recognition. The real heroism wasn't saving 47 people in Afghanistan. It was choosing to keep serving even when no one was watching, even when my own family dismissed my worth, even when society couldn't see the value in what I was contributing. 7 years after Operation Mountain Shield, I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. It's determined by the choices you make when no one is watching, the principles you're willing to sacrifice for, and the legacy you leave in the lives you touch. The little girl in the pink headscarf was saving lives as a doctor. My warehouse brothers were proud to have known me before the world did. My veterans group was helping transitioning service members find dignity in their own journeys, and somewhere, someone else was making the choice between following orders and following conscience, between seeking approval and maintaining integrity, between letting others define their worth and defining it themselves. That was the real medal, not the one around my neck, but the one carried in the hearts of people who understood that service, in any form, matters more than recognition.